Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Megan Kate Nelson presenting her latest book, Saving Yellowstone, Exploration and Preservation in Reconstruction America, in conversation with Virginia Scharff. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our ever-expanding community, both in the Cambridge area and elsewhere. Every week we host events here on our Zoom account, and upcoming virtual events include Megan O'Rourke in conversation with Gretchen Rubin, Ryan North in conversation with Randall Monroe, and Karen Joy Fowler in conversation with Ruth Ozeki. Please check out the event schedule on our website at harvard.com. And while you're there, you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates, and you can browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have if you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can click on the Q&A button on your screen, and we will get through as many as time allows. This event will have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom that you are using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase copies of Saving Yellowstone from harvard.com. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Harvard Square. So we thank you all so much for continuing to show up and tune in, not only in support of our authors, but also of the fantastic staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And lastly, as you may have experienced, probably likely have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past 2 years, technical issues may arise. We of course hope that they do not. If they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I am very pleased to introduce our speakers. Megan Kate Nelson is a writer and historian living in Lincoln, Massachusetts. She has written about the Civil War, U.S. Western history, and American culture for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Smithsonian Magazine, Preservation Magazine, and Civil War Monitor. Nelson earned her BA in History and Literature from Harvard University and her PhD in American Studies from the University of Iowa. In addition to Saving Yellowstone, Nelson is the author of The Three-Cornered War, Ruin Nation, and Trembling Earth. Virginia Scharff is Distinguished Professor of History Emerita at the University of New Mexico and Chair of Western History at the Autry Museum of the American West. Her books include Seeing Nature Through Gender, The Women Jefferson Loved, and Empire and Liberty, The Civil War and the West. Under the name of Virginia Swift, Scharff is also the author of 4 Mustang Sally mystery suspense novels published by HarperCollins. Tonight, they'll be discussing Megan Kate Nelson's new book, Saving Yellowstone, Exploration and Preservation in Reconstruction America. In late July 1871, geologist explorer Ferdinand Hayden led a team of scientists through a narrow canyon into Yellowstone Basin, entering one of the last unmapped places in the country. The survey's discoveries led to the passage of the Yellowstone Act in 1872, which created the first national park in the world. Saving Yellowstone follows Hayden and 2 other protagonists in pursuit of their own agendas, Sitting Bull, a Lakota leader, and financier Jay Cook. And Hayden, Cook, and Sitting Bull staked their claims to Yellowstone at a critical moment during Reconstruction, when the Grant administration and the 42nd Congress were testing the reach and the purpose of federal power in the wake of the Civil War. I am honored to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Megan Kate Nelson and Virginia Scharff.
Hi, Megan.
Hey, Ginge, how are you?
I'm good. I have my first question for you is, what are you drinking tonight?
Yes. Okay. So everyone in the audience, you must know that Gingy and I like to go out for cocktails whenever we see each other. So we decided that since we're seeing each other on Zoom, we would make some cocktails appropriate to the occasion. So I tonight am drinking the El Oro, which is a version of the Gold Rush, which, so the gold rush usually has whiskey or bourbon, but this has mezcal. As you know, I like it smoky. So it has mezcal and honey syrup and lemon. And I chose it because, the gold rush in saving Yellowstone is a very important moment, bringing white migrants to the Rockies in Montana, and starting a lot of conflict with the Lakota in this region. So what are you drinking, Ginge?
I'm here coming to you from New Mexico, and I'm drinking an Albuquerque Paloma. It's a little bit of white tequila and some Peychaud's bitters and some fresh grapefruit juice and soda. And I just want to say here's to saving Yellowstone, and here's to you. I'm excited to be here tonight. So everybody, if you need to take a moment and just freshen up your own beverage, do join us. I think it's interesting, Megan, that you start with the gold rush. Of course, gold rushes started in the United States, started in the South and moved west. And you did that too. So when you were doing your first scholarship as a young historian, you were working on Southern topics, like the Civil War West and like Reconstruction. I think some of the action has really shifted to the West. What made you decide to shift your focus as a historian from the South to the West?
Well, I don't know about you and how you develop your book projects, but I always kind of start to figure out the next project while I'm finishing the book that I'm writing. The first book was Trembling Earth. It was my dissertation. It was about the Okefenokee Swamp in southern Georgia. So I started out as a Southern environmental historian. And while I was mucking around in the swamps, I found ruins there. And so came up with the idea for Ruin Nation, which led me into Civil War studies for the first time, which I actually I'd never taken any undergrad classes. I'd never taken any grad classes. But I'm an American Studies PhD, and I love just researching new topics. Like when I did my dissertation, one of my advisors in the defense said, okay, well, the Okefenokee can be your first book, and then the Great Dismal will be your second, and then the Chaflaya will be your third. And I was like,
swamp by swamp.
Zero interest in that. Zero interest. Like, I want to go and explore new worlds, right? So I was knee deep in Civil War studies, mostly in the Southeastern Theater for Ruin Nation. And when I was finishing that book, I started to, and while I was teaching actually too, I discovered these battles that took place in New Mexico, which I did not know about as someone who grew up in Colorado, which, always interested me. And so, when you're a historian and you figure out you don't know something about a major moment in American history and you've never heard of it, you want to investigate it. So that's really what brought me west. Plus, I was kind of excited about the thought of coming home again after doing so much stuff in the Southeast. And once I was in the West, I didn't think that the Civil War was going to relinquish its hold upon me. Because, when you're in that, there's so much amazing material and so many things to think about and write about. But that is the same with Western history. And so as I was finishing Three Cornered War, one of the protagonists in that book is John Clark, who was the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory. And I was researching surveys and surveying in America, and I realized that coming up, and this was in 2018, coming up was Ferdinand Hayden's, the 150th anniversary of his exploration of Yellowstone, and therefore the 150th anniversary of the Yellowstone Act. And, anniversaries are such good moments for us to really think about what has happened in the past, why it happened, why it's important, why we still remember it and mark it today. And the thought of going to Yellowstone,
Nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, sometimes as historians, we're like, maybe we should just choose a topic so we can go to that place and
always a good idea.
Research. And so that was very appealing to me too, to be back in the Rockies and to do that sort of form of Western history. So it really was, all 4 of my book projects have been based in landscapes that have been a little bit weird, so swamps and ruins, the desert, and then Yellowstone. So they're connected that way, but they've sort of propelled me through space. But it's been great fun to be in the West. And this is, of course, how I met you and this whole coterie of amazing US West historians who have been so welcoming and lovely.
Well, I mean, Western historians are known to be characters, and you focus on 3 charismatic characters. You mentioned the anniversary of the Hayden survey, and I thought, we all celebrate that in our own fashion. I've always been fascinated by surveys myself. And what I think is so great about your book is that it situates the charismatic character of Ferdinand Hayden in a kind of triad with 2 other guys who are not on the surveys. Generally, when we read about the surveys, it's all about kind of heroic guys getting out there. But you're looking at Jay Cook. He's one of the other 2 main, the second of 3 main characters, and then the third being Sitting Bull. And this is not, a triplet that we would normally think of as kind of running a narrative in the history of the American West or the history of the United States. So why did you pick these guys? Why did you focus on doing these character studies in many ways, situated in really beautifully told landscapes? Why the device of kind of, really profiling these 3 guys in the middle of this big set of landscapes? What does that do to the larger story that you're telling?
Well, so first of all, these Hayden and Cook were in the project from the beginning, but as proposed, it was actually 5 guys. And I like to, and there were 5.
And that sounded like a burger chain, right?
I know, right? Well, they sound even more like a boy band when I tell you who and I referred to them actually as the Yellowstone boy band, because they were Ulysses, Jay, Ferdinand, Spencer, and John. And I was like, this is just the boy band of American exploration and culture, right? I ditched John Holland, who was the editor and founder of Scribner's Monthly, and Spencer Baird, who was the assistant director of the Smithsonian, because I felt like I was going to be able to tell their stories through Hayden. And so I didn't quite need them. And then as I was looking more at Cook, I realized that Sitting Bull was entering this narrative in a really unexpected and interesting way. So he came in, and initially there were 4 of them, and Ulysses S. Grant was sort of the 4th protagonist. But then as the project developed, I kind of figured out that he was not a main player, that he would come into the story more as context, as Reconstruction context, as part of the Grant administration, appointing very interesting people like Ely Parker and Amos Ackerman, and that he would kind of provide that instead of an on the ground follow him through space.
Although, I have to say, whenever Grant, walks on stage, it's pretty hard to shove him off. And so that's one of the great things about your book, is that you see that he's one actor in this universe of manly men, kind of making history in the 19th century United States landscape.
Oh, yeah. And there were others, too, that emerged. I think William Henry Jackson, the photographer, Thomas Moran, the painter, they emerged. They're almost sort of supporting players in this group. And this is a world of men, right? I mean, I tried so hard. We've discussed this before. I was like looking for the women. I was praying for a librarian at the Smithsonian or a scientist.
You were looking for the women, and they were looking to get away from the women. It just seemed that way. So much of their lives really about, let's find a manly space here.
Yes. No, that is exactly true. And they all had women in their lives. Many of them, wives who they dearly loved, who really shaped the way that they approached their entire life and their life's work. And so I wanted to include them. So you will get Molly Jackson, and you will get a kind of full sense of Sitting Bull's entire family with his wives and his children, his mother, who was a very strong influence upon him. But no one really emerged as someone who I could really use as a protagonist, like I did in Three Cornered War with Louisa Canby and Juanita. Yeah. I was very interested in still focusing on individuals, because I had done that in Three Cornered War and I loved it. And I really do think, people who are reading nonfiction history, they really like reading about ideas and arguments and the kind of big frame. But what really motivates them to turn the page are the stories of people, of individuals, of getting to actually know people. And so I really wanted to be able to focus on a couple of people that, Three Cornered War had 9 protagonists, which was a lot. I realized it was a lot. And so this one, only in the end having 3, but with a couple of people who you get to know a little better through context, I think worked pretty well. And they're all connected in really interesting ways. And those are I like that too. And I think that goes to my American Studies background also, is that I like seeing the connections between things that other people might think are just disparate, that have no connection to one another.
This book absolutely is one of the best books I've read that does that kind of thing. You would not think that the Great Chicago Fire and the bubbling mud volcanoes of Yellowstone were connected in any way, but you do manage to connect them. I want to hold that point for a second, because I want to dive in a little further to this whole question of, the thing that unites J. Cook, Ferdinand Hayden, and Sitting Bull is the large, enormous narrative of American history, one being the kind of story of enslavement and emancipation, but another one being westward, the course of empire. Yes. And so that all seems like it comes together with the ways in which these 3 men's lives converge in and around Yellowstone. And can you say a little something about how you do these big themes of American history through these lives and in this place, in this remarkably realized place in your book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we've all had that experience either as students or teachers, right? That the textbooks kind of silo Reconstruction, westward expansion, kind of Gilded Age corporate capitalism. And what I was realizing when I was researching this is that they're all coming together in this moment in 1871, which is earlier than really, I think a lot of people think about in terms of those 3 big areas of American history. And so the challenge was, how do I bring these 3 threads together? And I did it through these people, through Hayden and Cook and Sitting Bull, but also through Grant as that context of, here is a period of time, we're right in the middle of Reconstruction. And this was very interesting to me when I first started thinking about the Hayden Survey and the Yellowstone Act, that this is happening in 71, 72, which is also not a time a lot of people focus on in Reconstruction. Most of the time we're talking about the South during Reconstruction and not the West so much, although Western historians have been talking about the Reconstruction.
I was going to say, what are you talking about here?
Yeah. Western historians have been talking about this for 20 years. I mean, Heather Cox Richardson, Elliott West, and pretty much, I think everyone in Western history has embraced this idea, but it has not hit out in the larger popular consciousness. I think there is some resistance, maybe from Reconstruction scholars in expanding that geographic frame, and it's difficult to actually make that argument, but I think they are all connected through this federal government push in this moment to simultaneously fund the development and white settlement of the West, to initiate campaigns of native land dispossession, and to provide protection for 4 million people who have just been freed from enslavement and are transitioning to lives of freedom, and trying to deal with the white resistance to that and to the 14th and the 15th Amendment and the rights that they provided. And this is all part of a larger project of bringing the nation back together after an incredibly destructive civil war that really, hit at the heart of what the nation was. Was it actually going to survive, right? As a political project, as a culture. And it did, but just barely. And it was kind of just hanging on during this period. And so I really see the Yellowstone Expedition and the Yellowstone Act and Sitting Bull's resistance to a huge project like the Northern Pacific Railroad, and then also the federal government's campaign against the KKK in the South as all interconnected in that way. But that, these are all topics we think about together usually.
Yeah, and it's interesting the way that there's that dynamic of resistance to a kind of national control in the West and the South. I think you do that absolutely brilliantly. And really, what I really saw very clearly in this book is the way in which the project of Reconstruction in the West is not so much about bringing the nation kind of back into the fold as creating the nation out in a place where it didn't exist, creating, a railroad that will create kind of white supremacy in the West where it certainly did not exist. And in the mind of Sitting Bull was never gonna, right?
Exactly.
So that's all there, but surprisingly, the hero scientist Hayden and his merry band of men, including the brilliant painter Thomas Moran, including the amazing photographer William Henry Jackson, including a bunch of political boys who are like the sons of rich guys and congressmen who get to tag along for an adventure in Yellowstone. It's a rip-roaring tale. It's an extraordinary tale with characters, even the minor characters, I think, really come to life. And part of the reason that they do is because they leave incredible records. They leave journals and letters and diaries and measurements of various kinds of things and instrument readings and paintings and photographs. And you think about that kind of rich documentary record, and it almost sings to you as you're reading the book.
Yeah, it really was remarkable. They knew, I think, especially, Hayden's team knew that they were doing something remarkable and new, and that they were, the first kind of white Americans to really move into Yellowstone and record it, they believed, really fully for science, basically. And so they kept records, and they wrote letters to newspapers, and the newspapers covered the Yellowstone expedition. So I was able to go into a big digital database like newspapers.com and just input Hayden expedition and see how much coverage it was getting across the nation at these
That's
different
super cool.
Which is
so
cool.
That's a kind of research you wouldn't have been able to do 20 years ago.
No, not at all. And I was so lucky because, I wrote the vast majority of this book during the pandemic in my own living room. It was incredibly painful to me to do that because as an environmental historian, I love to go to the places that I am studying. And I had a trip planned to Yellowstone in May of 2020 and was supposed to go and look at the National Park Archives and dig into all of their stuff and travel through the park and look at all the sites, and couldn't do that, obviously. But I was so lucky in that, this was a government survey. And if we know one thing that government is good at doing, it's producing a lot of paper, right? So Hayden had to keep track of all of his expenses. He was writing letters back to Spencer Baird at the Smithsonian. He was sending items back, which are still in the Smithsonian collections. And you can see some digital images of them, which is so cool. And then, he was writing reports. There were map makers. Henry Elliott was sketching things on the top of mountains, these big panoramic sketches of the landscape. So they were producing records, and of all different kinds, written, visual, material. I mean, it was a dream for me, actually, as someone who uses all of those kinds of sources. It was amazing what I was able to find. But I'm really lucky that so much of that has been digitized. I had 1 week at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. I was looking at the Hayden survey records and the artwork and the maps. I saw the maps and the artwork kind of in person, in material reality. I was only able to look at the Harvard the survey documents on microfilm, which was kind of a bummer, but I was able to take pretty good pictures of them. And a week was enough to get the material that I wasn't able to get otherwise.
Well, I think about you being able to get access to all of these kinds of things from your, wearing your bunny slippers in your living room or whatever. And these guys schlepping all of this stuff up and down everything, up and down steep canyons, over bubbling mud flats, sometimes falling in, Hayden's shoes dissolving. That was one of my favorite moments in the book. He ends up having to walk back barefoot, with scalded pants and everything like that. But I think you so excel at bringing to life both the kind of extraordinary physical endeavor of this, but then the remarkable will to record and to document and to get the colors for Moran, just struggling with getting the colors right because no one is going to believe this. Or Jackson, schlepping this enormously heavy and cumbersome photographic equipment to get shots and him clambering up and down all over the place. And Hayden basically coming back with his exhausted crew and then saying, you know what, why don't you come with me? We need to go out and get some more stuff. And I just, I thought about this as, they were able to kind of treat this as both the most serious kind of scientific endeavor and a grand lark.
Yes.
And, that sense of like, that really brings to life a kind of a version of 19th century American culture that I think, a lot of us are pretty interested in.
Yeah. And, Hayden he was inexhaustible, and he loved it. He loved being out in the field, and he loved leading men out into the field. Like, this was his very favorite thing to do. I mean, he was fine and he was good and he was adept at writing up reports and lobbying congressmen, but really, and, he was a professor at Penn also, but really what he wanted to do, he lived for that 4-month period where he could go out to the West and just tramp around, wake up at 4:30 in the morning, discuss the plan of the day, let his men kind of go off and collect, and then come back together at the end of the day, discuss what they had found, pack everything up. I mean, he loved it. And it fed everything that every part of his character. He wanted to be out in nature. He wanted to think about things. He wanted to achieve things through collecting. I mean, he was really, I think you referred to all three of these people as charismatic, and they absolutely were. And that was one reason that Hayden was so successful.
Well, and I think, this made me want to give a copy of the book to every field scientist that I know, because I really recognize the type. And I know a lot of geologists and botanists and archaeologists and people like that. And every one of them, probably a lot of them have read some of the Hayden journals and things like that. The great surveys of the West have attracted a lot of attention on that part, but I think you bring them to life in a way that's amazing. But in part, that's also because they did leave such great records. And I want to know, I mean, you've now written 4 books. One of them was a finalist, your most recent one, for the Pulitzer Prize. Each book, I find the books that I've written, and I've written a bunch of different kinds of books, each one is different, and you learn something about yourself as a writer through this. So I want to ask you a little bit about your kind of process as a writer, not only, what's your process, but also how has it changed, and did reading this amazing wealth of literary material and looking at the visual stuff, did that change you as a writer? Did you find yourself kind of mimicking them? Was there an influence there?
Yeah, that's always the danger, right? That you will start kind of taking on the language, you'll absorb that style of either the primary document writers who you're looking at, or kind of more disastrously, the secondary source people, all the like great writers of history. You don't want to write too much like them. But yeah, I mean, I think from book to book, in my dissertation, I was just really interested. I was looking at 5 different communities in the Okefenokee over time. So that sort of spoke to my soul as someone who likes to, in each chapter, talk about something different, right? In Ruined Nation, I got a really great note from Aaron Sachs, who I think is one of the most beautiful writers in environmental history and in cultural history. And he read my manuscript, and he said, every chapter starts the same way. There's a little bit of the weather, there's a date, there's someone doing something. Can you mix it up a little? And that kind of gave me leave to experiment. And so I started one chapter with that exact sort of more traditional academic style. Then one chapter I started with just a straight up declaration of fact. And then another one I took, and this was the most fun. And this is how I knew I wanted to write in this kind of way. I took several accounts of women whose houses were broken into by soldiers. And I kind of just wrote an account that combined all of those, but it was my writing. And I loved that. And so I knew that's what sort of drove me in the Three-Cornered War to experiment more with form, to really find inspiration in fiction. I mean, you as a fiction writer, you know, like it is very freeing to be able to play around with form. And one of the things that I did in Three-Cornered War that I did also in Saving Yellowstone is that I took these great moments where these men are kind of voicing their reactions to the amazing geyser basins and the canyon. And some of those I turned into action, some of those, and then some of them I turned into dialogue.
Yeah.
Where it's not, you're not using a quote as evidence of something. You're using it as speech, which itself is action, right? But that, to me, that was a profound shift in the way that I thought about myself as a writer and the way that I was using historical evidence.
Well, I think you do a great job using point of view as a device. So, you know, just think about, you know, and it's very cinematic in many, many ways, you know. So we see somebody like walking down a street, getting ready to go into a building that we wouldn't necessarily think of as a dramatic moment. But if it's somebody, you know, walking out of a building, say, let's call it a saloon, and walking into a street and, you know, putting their hand on their hip, it's going to be Matt Dillon, you know, getting ready to, you know, have a battle in the street. So point of view, I think, is underestimated among many, many scholars. And I think you do a wonderful job with it in this book. It gives me a real feel for your historical imagination, which I think is just incredible. And it's great that you just gave us some tricks of the trade. I wanted to ask you a little bit about another kind of cinematic scene that really, really struck me in this book. And this is a moment where we realize what a national story this is. And this is actually after Hayden gets done out on the lark with the boys, doing all the work that they did, gets back on the train, comes back by way of Chicago, and the Great Chicago Fire has just occurred. And he has to make his way across the blackened ruin of Chicago. To me, that was one of the most evocative moments, because it felt like here's Hayden, you know, who's a man who operates on a national scale. And could you say something about, you know, why you chose to put so much in here about the Chicago Fire and what that means in this book?
Yeah, when I figured out that this was part of the context, I mean, part of my job here was to put readers on the ground with these three individuals. What are their life experiences? How are they motivated at this point? What are they doing? And then I also needed to give you a sense of what's going on in the nation in a larger sense, right? I kind of pull back, do a bird's eye view. This is something that I really struggled with initially with Three-Cornered War, and my editor, my amazing editor, Kathy Belden at Scribner, was just like, we had a phone call pretty early on, and she's like, you've got to pull back. Like, you know, the scene setting is great, the detail is great, but you have to give us a sense of how they're operating in space at, you know, as people living in a full-on nation. And so when I found out, I kind of figured out that Hayden was coming back exactly at the right time, you know, just a couple of days after the Chicago Fire. And one of the other survey teams out with him, which was actually a military survey under the command of Colonel John Barlow. Barlow was headquartered in Chicago, and he lost the vast majority of his specimens and other paperwork that he had from his Yellowstone expedition. And so I thought, you know, what was most interesting to me is that Hayden's expedition was almost trouble-free through the entire time in the Yellowstone Basin.
Yes,
you know,
that's shocking.
Yeah, they lost a couple people. They had to send some people home because they, you know, were sick and just not really prepared. But otherwise, everything went totally fine. The disasters kind of came later, right? There's something I don't want to do a spoiler, but one of the survey team members, something happens to him right after the survey returns. And then there's the Chicago Fire and the destruction of all of Barlow's specimens and his items. And he's in real dire straits, and he has to borrow some things from Hayden as a result of that. And then I found out that Hayden, in fact, went through Chicago as a major railway hub. So of course, when he got off the transcontinental at Omaha and then crossed on the ferry, he took a train. He was going back to Philadelphia. So he took a train through Chicago. And I was just trying to imagine, and actually he blew off Barlow. He's like, yeah, I'm in the city, but I'm not going to come see you. And that's just vintage Hayden, that he wouldn't in fact do that. But I then became really interested in this journey that he was making. Of course, I always love ruins from my work on Ruined Nation. So I knew I wanted that in there, but the Chicago Fire was really one of these truly national events in the time after the Civil War that brought a lot of people together. Everyone was focused on it. It was a huge tragedy. It was a very shocking event. And I wanted to show that, but from Hayden's perspective, so that you would see him kind of in transit in this moment that, again, a lot of people know about, but either wouldn't connect with Reconstruction or wouldn't connect with any of the kind of ideas that we have about westward expansion and manifest destiny.
So I want to bring in a question that showed up in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee. Thank you for being here. I think Glenna Matthews' question, I think we touched on your question a little bit tangentially, I think, but if you don't think we've answered it, please let me know. But let me ask you this question, Megan. So this attendee asks, the three leading men in the book seem to set the stage for the three major stakeholders and opponents that appear in the origin story of so many national parks, government, commerce, and First Nations people. Was that deliberate on your part, or is it just that what's past is prologue?
Oh, that is a great question. That's a really good question.
Yeah.
It was not deliberate, but as I was investigating these stories and researching them and writing them, it became really clear to me that a lot of these tensions and conflicts and claims we see over and over again in these moments about Western lands, about any kind of land claiming across the continent. And they're still with us today, right? The whole idea of the use of federal power to save or not save wilderness lands or public lands or forest lands, give them over to commercial development. I mean, we had during the Trump administration a real moment where we saw actually how fragile that relationship is, because so much of it depends on executive power instead of congressional action. A president who wants to, completely destroy a wilderness reserve can in fact do it. And the arguments that people are making about how land should be used from the government perspective, the commercial capitalist perspective, and from the indigenous perspective are still with us. I mean, we've seen them, in the past couple of years very vividly.
So let's talk a little bit about Sitting Bull. I feel like we haven't really gotten to talk about that. And I think he's just such a powerful presence in this book. And, not only is he, let it be said, there are plenty of Indigenous people coming and going through Yellowstone during the period in which Ferdinand Hayden and the boys have a camping trip out there.
Yes.
So Sitting Bull enters into that space at a relatively late point in your story, but he's present in the story. So what was it about him that made him your focus in terms of trying to represent the remarkable number of Indigenous people who are contending for this space that the United States government and American capitalists and science boys like Ferdinand Hayden are trying to overcome?
Yeah, what I found really captivating about Sitting Bull is that he comes to the fore at this moment. Like he had already attained leadership positions within the Hunkpapa Lakota, within kind of the Lakota world more broadly, and among kin and allies, among the Cheyenne and Arapaho in the 1850s and 1860s. But he really kind of consolidated that power. He was not the only chief or war leader, even of his own band, but he kind of came to the fore and began to articulate his people's claims on their own land and their determination not to be removed to any reservation and not to give that land up to anyone during this period. And he really started in the 1860s with the gold rush, attacking and trying to prevent gold miners from crossing from the Missouri to the Rockies straight through their homeland. And when Hayden set out in 71, he benefited from the Transcontinental Railroad, but he also was very happy to avoid the only other way he was going to get to Yellowstone, which was up the Missouri and across Lakota Lands. And so, Sitting Bull is exerting himself in this moment. He is sometimes agreeing to peace talks, but often not complying. And he really becomes a symbol of Native resistance, not only for his own people, but also for the American government. Everyone, when you look at all of the reports coming out from Indian agents, from territorial officials, Sitting Bull's name starts to populate those records during this period.
Well, and what he's also doing, though, and I found this, so powerful, not only is because he's such a symbol of resistance and such a symbol of kind of strength and of militancy. We think of him as, really operating along that kind of one plane. But in fact, you show he's working in a world where he's having to restrain some of the young hotheads in his own band and who basically want to go out and really screw up any truce he's negotiated, or, no, we're not ready to attack at this point. And when they're questioning his bravery, he's like, I'll show you I'm brave. And there's a moment there in the book that's just amazing where there's a battle going on and they're accusing him of chickening out. And he just walks out onto the battlefield and sits down and starts smoking a pipe.
Yeah.
And, calls. And I just thought, that's a moment when he doesn't have to be county coup. He doesn't have to be shooting at anybody, but that speaks to his stature and his bravery and his willingness to just say, you want a piece of me, you come and talk to me while I'm sitting here smoking a pipe. And it's a powerful, powerful moment in that book.
Yeah. And I think what we learn, and I really did privilege Indigenous sources when writing about Sitting Bull. There are many really fine historians who have written about him, usually from a military perspective, with U.S. Army records. But what I tried to do is to take Lakota sources and use them first, and then use the non-native sources as more context. And I also I met a scholar who is Lakota Dakota, Jameson Sweet, who is a professor at Rutgers. I met him through Twitter, actually. And so was able to ask him if he would read the manuscript. And he did do that for me. And he also, I paid him to do it. It was not free work, but because trade books do not do peer review. So I went out and found my own reviewers. So he read for me, he gave me amazing comments, recommended some great sources. And then he also consulted with me on the use of Lakota language in the book. And
which is powerfully done, really gracefully done, I think, thanks to him, by the way. And if you happen to be out there on this call, Jameson Sweet, thank you for doing this, because it really affected this book.
Yeah, it was really, really helpful to me to have that perspective. And I also wanted, I wanted to use original Lakota terms for a lot of things. And some of them are retained in the context of the book throughout. Other times I use the English translation if I think it's kind of easier to navigate in the context of the book. But I really wanted to, again, put readers on the ground with him and in Lakota society at this moment, which, I think I saw in the book this early time of 71, 72, 73 as really the beginning of the road to Little Bighorn, to Greasy.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm gonna, we've got another attendee who's got a question here that I think is a fabulous question.
Excellent.
So was there anything in your research that you found surprising? Anything that ended up on the cutting room floor that you wish you could have included?
So much. There were so many things. Usually for me, the things that end up on the cutting room floor are just really great details, really like deep dive research elements. The original manuscript of the book had an entire chapter devoted to the first trial, the first KKK trial in South Carolina. And in fact, I went on like a 2 or 3 day deep dive trying to figure out where they held the trial in Columbia, South Carolina, because they didn't say. in all of the reports, and in most of the newspaper accounts, they did not say. And so I had all this great detail. I had all this drama about this KKK member and all the witnesses and all the testimony. And it just wasn't working, with the narrative overall. I still have that, all of that research, and I think maybe it could turn into something else at another point. But there were things like that all the way along, elements of the expedition that I had to cut out that were just kind of charming things that I found through sources. Like the expedition comes out of Yellowstone. They're in Paradise Valley along the Yellowstone River, encamped at this place called Butler's Ranch, which is a very important way station. And suddenly Henry Elliott, who's the illustrator, and Albert Peel, who's a Penn student, who is a mineralogist, just decide they're going to climb Immigrant Peak. And so they cross the Yellowstone River. They start going up. They wake up really early in the morning. They abandon their horses at 8,000 feet and they climb to the top. And I have Elliott's sketch of the view from the top of Immigrant Peak. I have Albert Peel's diary entry where he describes them scrambling up and how Elliott gets there like an hour before him. And then how they scramble back down. But that got left on the cutting room floor. It was a great moment where sources were kind of coming together and I could corroborate an experience they were having, but it didn't seem to really do anything for the narrative overall in a way that was going to be really useful.
So I'm gonna, I have one question, then we have one from an attendee, and I'm just gonna take the opportunity to ask my question, which is, all right, we're going to cast the miniseries now because this thing is so cinematic that, and frankly, I have been absolutely incapable of watching the series Yellowstone because I find it so unwatchable, quite honestly, for reasons of my own that do not bear going into. But I would much rather be looking at the Saving Yellowstone miniseries. So I got to ask you, who's going to play Ferdinand Hayden and Jay Cook and Sitting Bull? And maybe, Moran and Jackson and Pig Iron Kelly and some of the other characters, but at least the big three. Who plays them?
Okay, so my candidate, if I were the casting director, I would call Cillian Murphy for Hayden. Because Hayden reportedly had these very piercing blue eyes and he was an extremely intense person and kind of really physically intense. And I think Cillian Murphy could pull that off. I think he could pull it off. Plus, he has kind of a 19th century look, So I think he'd be great. Cook, I mean, he's a little harder. He's kind of in his early 50s. He's this titan of industry, but he's obsessed with this railroad and super frustrated that he can't sell these bonds. And just based on sort of beard awesomeness alone, I think I'm going to go with George Clooney for that.
Oh, I love it. I love George Clooney as Jay Cook. I mean, he'd play it as a kind of a Coen Brothers version of Jay Cook, I think.
Yeah, he might be a little bit sort of frantic, but that might work pretty well.
I'd be down with it. I'd be fine with that.
And there'd be scenes of him fishing off of Gibraltar, his giant island summer home. And then Sitting Bull, I was thinking about this. So there's an actor named Martin, I think it's Sensmeyer, who is Native Alaskan. And he's played a bunch of roles recently. He's in his late 30s, which is exactly how old Sitting Bull was. Sitting Bull is the youngest. Wow. He's the youngest of all of the kind of three main players. He's also the one who's born into the most kind of elite status family. He has his father is a chief, his uncle is a chief, and his family is very powerful. Unlike Hayden Cook, was the son of a lawyer, but definitely, higher status than Hayden. And he played, I know you haven't watched this either, because it's the prequel to Yellowstone, but the show 1883, he is in it. And plays a pretty substantial role, and he is wonderful. He plays a Comanche chief and scout named Sam, but he's marvelous. And speaking of Yellowstone, I think that Gil Birmingham, who plays the head of what is kind of Crow Nation in that show, would be a great Ely Parker, who was Grant's appointee as the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. I think he would be, I mean, and he actually kind of looks like him in a little bit of way. I think Jared Leto would be a great Thomas Moran, because Moran was like this skinny, intense guy and also had these big blue eyes and was super charismatic. Apparently everyone loved Moran. Everyone who met him just loved him. And he could just talk to you about painting and convince you to buy one for thousands of dollars.
I actually know a few artists like that in Taos. I got to tell you, I bought a few paintings from the Blue-Eyed Boys of Taos. So,
So I think he would be good. And I think Sebastian Stan would be a good William Henry Jackson.
Okay. So we've got
go
and,
with,
you know, as they say in Hollywood, who needs parts for women? All right. Well, I think we're about ready.
Okay.
Yeah, go on.
Do we have one question from
one more question here, which is, you talked about the winding road that led you from Southern to Western history. Do you have an idea of what you want to write about next? I reckon you do. I know you do, actually.
I do. I am already researching and writing it, and there are women in it. Yes, like a protagonist, awesome women. So it's a book called The Westerners. And it is, again, a biographically based history of the West, but it is a much longer frame. So, you know, Three Cornered War was 7 years. Saving Yellowstone is basically a year and a half. This is going to be from the early 1800s to the 1880s. So big history. But Ginge, I'm so excited because one of the protagonists is Maria Gertrudis Barcelo Latulis, the gambling hall owner in Santa Fe when Carney went through there. So I'm going to be coming back to New Mexico.
Yay!
Yes. Yeah. So I am staying in the West. The West has hooked me, at least for this next project. And thankfully, this is also a project that it is going to be a little bit longer. It won't be out until probably 2025, 26. So I have a lot more time. I can actually, hopefully, pandemic willing, we'll knock on all the wood. I can go to archives around the West and get back to what historians like doing best,
which is getting out there and doing stuff. You sound like Ferdinand Hayden.
I know.
I know. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you. Thank you, Gingy, for being in conversation with me. This was really a treat.
Thank you to both of you. This was just such a delightful conversation. And thanks to all of you for spending your Friday night with us. And I've reposted the link to purchase Saving Yellowstone from Harvard Bookstore in the chat. And support your local independent bookstore. Buy books, buy this book specifically. And on behalf of all of us at Harvard Bookstore, please have a lovely evening, happy reading, and stay safe and well. And thanks again, Ginge and Megan. Thank you. This was truly a delight.
Thanks a lot, guys. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good evening, everybody.